The history of monarchs is filled with grandeur, triumph, betrayal, and tragedy. Kings and queens have often lived lives larger than reality, shaping the destiny of nations and leaving behind legacies that are remembered for centuries. Yet behind the crowns and ceremonies, they were also human beings, vulnerable to the same fragilities as anyone else. In fact, some of the most powerful rulers in history met their end not on the battlefield, not through assassination, but in ways that can only be described as bizarre and deeply ironic. Among these unusual stories, the death of King Edmund II of England stands out as one of the strangest. Known as Edmund Ironside, his short reign was marked by war defiance and an iron will, but his death is remembered less for his heroism and more for the peculiar circumstances in which he supposedly lost his life. On a privy, in a moment that turned an entire kingdom's fate upside down. Edmund II ascended the throne in 1016, a year of turmoil for England. His father, King Ethelred the Unready, had died that same year, leaving behind a realm in chaos. The Danish invasion led by King Canute was tearing the country apart. Edmund, however, refused to accept defeat. He quickly earned the name Ironside for his courage and tenacity in battle, pushing back the Danes in a series of fierce campaigns. Though young and inexperienced, he displayed a warrior's determination that inspired loyalty among his followers. For a brief time, it seemed as though England might withstand the Danish onslaught under his leadership. The struggle between Edmund and Canute became a clash of titans, two kings locked in relentless conflict for control of the English crown. Battles were fought across the land from Pen Selwood to Schurston, and finally, the fateful Battle of Assassinated. Though Edmund fought bravely, the outcome of these battles often hung in the balance, with betrayals and shifting allegiances weakening his cause. Ultimately, after months of bloodshed, the two rivals agreed to a compromise. England would be divided. Edmund would rule Wessex in the south, while Canute controlled the north. It was an uneasy peace, but for a moment, it spared the kingdom further devastation. Yet this peace was destined to be short-lived. Only weeks after the agreement, Edmund was dead. His sudden and unusual passing in November 1016 shocked his followers and cleared the way for Canute to take the entire English throne without opposition. The details of how Edmund died are shrouded in mystery and colored by rumor, but the most notorious version claims that the young king met his end while answering nature's call. According to this tale, Edmund went to the privy, essentially a medieval toilet, and while seated, he was assassinated in an almost humiliating fashion. The story suggests that a hidden assassin struck him from beneath, stabbing him fatally in the rectum. The image is both grotesque and strangely undignified, especially for a man known for his iron courage in battle. This version of events was recorded centuries later, and historians have long debated whether it was fact or myth. Some chroniclers of the time simply noted that Edmund died suddenly, offering no explanation. Others claimed he died from wounds sustained in battle or from natural illness. But the privy assassination story proved too striking to ignore, and it spread through legend, cementing itself as the most remembered version of his death. For medieval chroniclers and storytellers, the irony was irresistible. A king who had fought ferociously to defend his land, who had withstood countless blows on the battlefield, undone not by swords or arrows, but by treachery in the most private and humiliating of circumstances. There is also the possibility that the privy story was a piece of propaganda, designed to tarnish Edmund's memory and magnify Canute's legitimacy as king. To say that a ruler died in such a shameful manner could have been a way of diminishing his reputation in the eyes of future generations. After all, the medieval world often used stories and rumors as weapons, shaping the image of kings and enemies alike. A glorious death on the battlefield was considered noble and heroic, while a death on the toilet, ambushed like a helpless man, stripped away the aura of majesty. Whether true or not, the story of Edmund's death has survived for nearly 1,000 years, a bizarre reminder of how even the strongest kings could be mocked by fate. What makes Edmund's end particularly fascinating is the way it highlights the fragility of power. Here was a man who had resisted one of the most formidable conquerors of the age, who had secured a temporary peace and preserved part of his kingdom, only to be erased from the stage of history in an instant. His death not only ended his reign but also altered the course of English history. With Edmund gone, Knut consolidated his rule over the entire country, establishing a dynasty that would dominate for decades. If Edmund had lived longer, the story of England might have unfolded very differently. Instead, his bizarre death became the turning point that gave Knut undisputed control. In the centuries that followed, the tale of Edmund Ironside's privy death was retold with both horror and humor. For some, it was a cautionary tale about treachery, illustrating that danger can lurk even in the most mundane moments. For others, it became a macabre joke, a reminder that kings are still flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same humiliations as ordinary men. Even today, the story captures the imagination precisely because it is so out of place with the grandeur we usually associate with kingship. It strips away the layers of ceremony and power to reveal a moment that is both shocking and strangely human. The peculiar account of Edmund's death reveals much about how stories were told and remembered in the medieval world. Chroniclers were not simply recorders of events. They were interpreters, shaping history through the lens of morality, symbolism, and political agendas. The privy assassination tale, whether true or invented, fit neatly into the kind of narratives that medieval audiences found both believable and instructive. To them, the way a king died often carried as much meaning as the way he lived. A noble death reflected divine favor, while a shameful end could be seen as punishment for pride, sin, or poor fortune. Thus, the claim that Edmund, a fierce warrior, was killed in so undignified a setting might have been intended to teach a lesson as much as to entertain. One reason this story may have gained traction is that Edmund's reign was so brief that little else could be remembered about him. He ruled for only 7 months, an almost fleeting presence on the throne. His most defining quality was his resistance against the Danish invaders. And when he died, his accomplishments were quickly overshadowed by Knut's long and stable rule. In such a context, the strangeness of his death became the most memorable detail, eclipsing his victories and courage. In this way, Edmund became a figure defined not by his life, but by the peculiarities of his end. The assassination from beneath story also reflects the medieval fascination with irony and reversal of fortune. Kings were expected to embody strength, dignity, and divine authority. To imagine such a figure brought low in a place associated with filth and privacy was to see the ultimate inversion of kingship. It reminded listeners that no matter how high one rose, fate could strike at any moment, reducing a ruler to humiliation. This theme recurs throughout medieval storytelling, where prideful lords and kings often suffered dramatic and ironic downfalls. Edmund's story fit perfectly into that mold, whether or not it actually happened that way. Another factor to consider is the political convenience of Edmund's death. His sudden passing left no time for a contested succession or renewed war. Knut was able to step into full kingship almost effortlessly, claiming legitimacy through the earlier Treaty of Division, and through his subsequent marriage to Emma of Normandy, the widow of Edmund's father. The possibility that Edmund was deliberately murdered is not difficult to believe in such a context. Political assassinations were hardly rare in the medieval era, and the privy provided an ideal setting for a concealed attack. The act would have been both practical, catching the king at his most vulnerable, and symbolic, stripping him of royal dignity. If an assassin indeed carried out the deed, it was a chillingly effective choice of method. The story of Edmund's death also invites comparison with other unusual royal demises across history. Monarchs, for all their power, often found themselves subject to the cruelest whims of fate. Consider the case of King George II of Britain, who centuries later reportedly died on the toilet as well, collapsing from an aortic aneurysm. Or the case of Attila the Hun, whose fearsome reign ended not in battle, but on his wedding night, when he is believed to have suffocated from a nosebleed. In each case, the manner of death seemed incongruous with the might of the ruler, highlighting the frailty that lies behind crowns and thrones. Edmund's story, then, is part of a larger tradition in which kings are remembered as much for their deaths as for their deeds. In England, the memory of Edmund Ironside was eventually absorbed into myth and speculation. Later chroniclers even entertained the idea that his descendants might have continued a rival line to the throne, keeping alive the hope of resisting the Danish rulers. His unusual death only added to the mystique of such claims, for it gave the impression that his reign had been cut off prematurely by treachery. The narrative of betrayal and humiliation made him a tragic figure. A king denied his rightful chance to shape the kingdom's future. This sense of tragedy deepened the fascination with his end, ensuring that the story would continue to be retold for centuries. The Privy Tale also reveals something about how humor and death were intertwined in medieval thought. Today, toilet humor is often considered crude, but in the medieval imagination it had a particular power. Bodily functions were seen as both shameful and universal, a reminder that even kings could not escape the most basic human needs. By situating Edmund's death in such a context, the story placed him squarely within the human condition, stripping away the divine aura of monarchy. Listeners may have laughed at the absurdity, but they also would have recognized a darker truth, that all men, no matter how mighty, are equally vulnerable when nature calls. Of course, historians remain divided on the authenticity of the tale. Some argue that it is little more than scandalous rumor, propagated long after Edmund's time. Others suggest that while the exact details may be exaggerated, there is likely a kernel of truth. Perhaps he was assassinated in private, and the privy detail was added later to make the story more colorful. Either way, the fact that this version has persisted for nearly a millennium demonstrates its enduring appeal. Stories that combine power, death, irony, and a touch of grotesque humor tend to survive, because they speak to fundamental human fascinations. Edmund's privy death is one such story, impossible to forget once heard. By the time Canute fully secured his throne, Edmund was already fading from memory. Yet the legend of his death ensured that he would not be forgotten entirely. Instead, he became a symbol of the strange turns history can take, when a man who might have rivaled the greatest rulers of his age is instead remembered for an ignoble and bizarre demise. His life was brief, his reign even briefer, but his end immortalized him in a way that countless anonymous kings never achieved. That is the paradox of Edmund II. Remembered not for his victories, but for the privy in which his story ended. When looking at the tale of Edmund II, it becomes clear that his death belongs to a wider catalog of strange and often humiliating royal demises that punctuate the history of monarchy. Kings and emperors are often imagined as larger-than-life figures, destined to exit the world with grandeur, or at least with solemnity. Yet history is filled with reminders that rulers could die in the most ordinary, awkward, or even absurd circumstances. These accounts, whether fully true or embellished, serve not only as curiosities, but also as cultural reflections of how societies viewed power, mortality, and the ironies of fate. Consider, for example, the death of King Alexander of Greece in the early 20th century. Despite being a modern monarch, his end was no less bizarre than Edmund's. He died from an infection caused by the bite of a pet monkey, a shocking and almost comical way for a king to perish in an age of great political upheaval. Or think of King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who supposedly ate himself to death in the 18th century after consuming an extravagant meal that ended with 14 helpings of his favorite dessert. Such deaths remind us that monarchs, despite the weight of crowns upon their heads, could be undone by the most trivial or mundane circumstances. Edmund's privy death belongs in this same tradition, a story that combines the grotesque with the absurd, reminding us of the limits of human power. For the medieval imagination, these stories carried moral significance. A humiliating death was not only a physical reality but also a symbol of divine justice or the folly of human pride. To die on a battlefield might signify courage and noble sacrifice. But to die in a privy, a kitchen, or at the claws of an animal suggested that fate had intervened in ironic punishment. Edmund, though a brave warrior, may have been remembered in this way because his brief reign failed to deliver the victory his people hoped for. His bizarre end then became a narrative device to explain why he did not succeed, as though his humiliating death reflected the futility of his cause. Whether or not this was consciously intended, it shows how storytelling in history often serves as a way of making sense of disappointment or confusion. From a modern perspective, the fascination with these deaths reveals our ongoing interest in the vulnerability of the powerful. There is something compelling, even irresistible, about seeing kings and queens stripped of their grandeur by fate's hand. Perhaps it reassures us that no one, no matter how exalted, is free from life's indignities. Perhaps it amuses us to imagine that the mighty can fall in ways that would be considered ridiculous for ordinary people. Or perhaps it simply humanizes them, reminding us that behind the crowns and robes, they too were subject to the same accidents, illnesses, and bodily weaknesses as anyone else. Edmund's death, real or exaggerated, continues to attract attention precisely because it feels both absurd and oddly relatable. In the case of Edmund Ironside, the consequences of his death were profound. What might have been a long and heroic reign was cut off in an instant, handing the entirety of England to Knut. This not only reshaped the destiny of the kingdom, but also changed the trajectory of European politics. Knut's rule integrated England more closely with Scandinavia, altering the cultural and political landscape for generations. In this sense, the privy death of a king was no laughing matter. It altered the fate of nations. That such a monumental shift in history could hinge on so strange a moment only adds to the surreal quality of the tale. The endurance of Edmund's story also reflects the power of narrative to outlive fact. Historians may question the veracity of the assassination on the Privy Tale, but the details are almost irrelevant to its survival. What matters is the image it paints. A warrior king, fearless in battle, struck down in his most vulnerable moment. That image has proven too vivid to forget, passed down through chronicles, legends, and retellings until it has become inseparable from Edmund's identity. In this way, legend becomes as powerful as history, shaping the memory of kings as surely as their victories or laws. In the end, the story of Edmund II's strange death invites us to reflect on the dual nature of kingship. On one hand, monarchs were elevated figures, wielding immense authority, commanding armies, and claiming divine sanction. On the other, they were fragile human beings, subject to the same humiliations and absurdities as their subjects. The tension between these two realities is what gives stories like Edmund's their enduring fascination. They reveal not just the fallibility of kings, but also the unpredictability of history itself. A single twist of fate, a single moment of vulnerability, can change the course of an entire nation. So when we remember Edmund Ironside, we remember both the iron-willed warrior who refused to yield to invaders and the man whose death became a symbol of irony and vulnerability. His life demonstrates the courage of resistance, but his death reminds us that no crown can shield its wearer from the peculiar whims of fate. Kings may shape history, but history, in turn, has a way of humbling kings. Edmund's story, strange as it is, continues to echo across the centuries, not because it flatters the dignity of monarchy, but because it strips that dignity bare, leaving us with a reminder of the humanity that lies beneath the crown.